Thanks very much, James, and I can, with full sincerity, commend James's book Van Diemen's Land to any interested reader. I've spent the last week mostly in bed with bronchitis. Apparently I'm not alone in this. Our next speaker, Geoffrey Blainey, has also been feeling a bit crook. I have a Ventolin puffer to hand if you need it, Geoffrey. However, it is a fantastically accessible and well-researched exploration of a number of pervasive myths, and I do commend it to you. It's always been my ambition, which will now be realised, to introduce someone who needs no introduction. And that is certainly true of Geoffrey Blainey, a distinguished Australian historian, of whose works I will say no more because I'm sure you're all familiar with at least some of them, and if you haven't read them you'll know broadly the themes of many. The first time I encountered Geoffrey's work was in his quite early book, The Tyranny of Distance. The Tyranny of Distance took the theme of distance as a factor in Australia's history and explored it in a number of ways which are extremely well written and interesting, even though at first they seem to be slightly dry and not particularly appealing. What was it, for example, that the ships that arrived in Australia bearing convicts or supplies of one sort or another, rum, what was it that they took back all the way across the world? There is a chapter devoted to this question of the return cargo, and it is explored in some detail, and it is fascinating. It makes you realise something which I think, getting back to my earlier theme of archival history, the detail of what certain people did to make a living or to deal with a certain set of circumstances long ago rescues the humanity and complexity of real history from myth. Fables agreed upon are always fairly simple, fairly clear-cut, and they tend to lump people together into broad categories. History, through its focus on the detail, which is then, as James so rightly points out, put in context, rescues humanity and individuality. It's my belief that in Geoffrey Blainey's work that this rescuing of humanity, of the individual experience of ordinary people at different times and places, has been a very strong and worthwhile theme. Without further ado, let's welcome Geoffrey to the podium. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much, Richard, for your generous words, and thanks to what you've said, James. Good luck with your new book. I haven't read it all, but it's most gracefully written. I listened to the remarks, but I missed occasional remarks. This building is incredibly distracting. You know, if you're sitting on the platform and you're listening with great interest to what is said, and you look around, suddenly you're surrounded by disagreement. The building looks as though it disagrees with itself, doesn't it? It's very ingenious and very commanding, but it's astonishingly distracting. Which gets me to Napoleon's statement. I'm ashamed to say, I'd not heard of the quotation before. History is a fable agreed upon. History sometimes is a fable, maybe more frequently than we would wish. History is a fable. Sometimes it's agreed upon, sometimes it's not agreed upon. I think history as a discipline, as a way of investigation, often gains through disagreement rather than through agreement. I think Australian history passes through periods of profound disagreement amongst historians and the public who reads history. Maybe we're in a period of profound disagreement at the moment. Why is it that history is so often appealed to? Last year there was a German professor out here from Dusseldorf, and I understand he's writing a book on why history in Australia occupies the peculiar place it does at present and has maybe for the last quarter century. And his argument is that so many of the important issues in Australian politics and culture and social life today have in them an appeal to history. The Republican debate is often an appeal to history or against history. All the questions involving Aborigines, their past and their present, and their future place in Australian society have a very strong historical component. The present discussion about climate change and the greenhouse effect have a very powerful historical component. He said it's incredible to come to a country after Germany, and I would have thought Germany was full of historical debate, but he said it's incredible to come to Australia and find Manning Clark, though he's dead, so often discussed, Henry Reynolds so often discussed, and other historians so often discussed, and he couldn't think of any time in Germany in the last 25 years when matters of history so caught the public imagination. The greenhouse question, and that to me is one of the most interesting intellectual questions of our time and maybe for the last 100 years. One doesn't know what will happen, where we're all going, because it's got large areas of uncertainty as well as areas of relative certainty. But I was very interested the other day in the appeals to history. You know, we're passing through a terrible drought in the southeastern corner of Australia, and Victoria's had 10 or 12 years of fairly severe drought. When they had the summit on climate in Canberra, I think in November of 2006, somebody said, a high official, that this was a drought in 1,000 years. It aroused my interest. I thought, how do you know that this is a drought of 1,000 years in the Murray-Darling Basin? Because we haven't got records going back 1,000 years. And I went to libraries and I gathered what records I could get. We've only got rainfall records in Australia, Australia-wide, going back to 1900. We have earlier records, but we don't have sufficient weather stations across the continent to have an Australia-wide, all-Australia rainfall record. I was surprised to find, and I reported this in The Australian because they gave me some space, I was surprised to find that the two driest years in Australia, since we've had nationwide rainfall records, are 1902 and 1905. I would have thought they might have been in the last 10 years, but no, they're 1902 and 1905. I thought the statement that this was a drought in 1,000 years would never be recaptured. When some of these statements are released, they run for their lives and they can never be brought back. But that statement, surprisingly, is rarely heard today. People have got some strong sense of history and they're saying it's too early to tell whether this present drought is unique and therefore whether it's largely or to a small degree a component of global warming. But that's a simple example of our appeals to history. There's another reason why appeals to history in Australia are so strong, and that's that Australian history is an unploughed paddock. The ploughing is only beginning, and the ploughing leads to all kinds of discoveries that are quite new. Again and again, discoveries are made that throw new light on Australian history and lead to debate and agreement or disagreement year after year. A simple example, when I was writing the history of Melbourne University more than 50 years ago, a young archaeologist came to me and said, I'm going to dig in South Australia in a cave on the banks of the Murray. We've got about 8 or 10 people going, we've only got one car. I had a second-hand car. He said, do you think you could carry some people? I said, that's all right. He said, will you also cook and chop the wood and help with the dig? So we set out. In those days when you went to South Australia, You stopped at Bordertown for the night. That was a good day's journey. Eventually we came to this cave near Manham in South Australia, overlooking the Murray, and the excavation began. It was one of the most important excavations in Australian history, and far and away the most important of that time. They found carbon remains of fires in the cave, and the carbon enabled them to date how long ago the Aborigines had been camped in that cave overlooking the Murray River. The date was 5,000 years ago. The Aborigines had been here for 5,000 years. People said that's astonishing. We thought they'd only been here since sometime after the birth of Christ. Then in 1968, a Melbourne geologist, James Bowler, far to the northeast of Mildura, in Lake Mungo, found an Aboriginal cremation, and they could date that to some 20,000 years ago. And Lake Mungo has been pushed back beyond 30,000 years. In the space of 15 years, from 1956 to 1971, the antiquity of human occupation in Australia had been pushed back from an unknown period, maybe 2,000 years, to 40 or 50,000 years. The ramifications of that discovery for our knowledge of this continent are profound, and we're still trying to come to terms with them. We now know, but we can't be certain, so much is uncertain, that at the very time when agriculture, having been invented in the Middle East and other places, when the domestication of plants and animals was spreading fairly quickly around the globe, it reached New Guinea about the same time that Australia was cut off from New Guinea, and Torres Strait and the Gulf of Carpentaria were formed by the great rising of the seas. So that the Aboriginals who had been long in Australia were cut off by and large from the outside world at a time when the world was going through a change more profound than the Industrial Revolution. I think the domestication of plants and animals, which is really the domestication of human beings as well, that is more important, more shattering than the Industrial Revolution. We're still coming to grips with that problem and all it poses in studying Aboriginal history and the very short European history of this land. So there are many reasons why disagreement rages in Australia on historical questions, partly because there are so many live topics here that are appeals to history, and partly because Australian history is a relatively new field, Aboriginal history and European history, and surprise after surprise is coming to us, and sometimes we agree, and sometimes we disagree in how to cope with those surprises.
Thank you for your kind attention, and thank you to the Melbourne Writers Festival for organising this wonderful event.